Welcome, everyone, to Latter Daily Digest. We aim to promote and celebrate creators. And Rob Lauer is we'll say, poet and playwright. And he's been on our show before talking about the Beehive State. Was the name of
That was the name of it, yep.
Of it. And also, Rob is, I don't know, what do you call it, follower, congregant?
I was in the LDS church for 30 years.
But I mean, like Reformed Mormon?
Yeah, I'm a Reformed Mormon, which is not a church. It's not the Reformed LDS church. It's an approach to Mormonism that was devised about 22 years ago by a fellow named Mike Rashan. There's a website, www.reformmormonism.org, and it's just a way of approaching Mormonism without church, without the hierarchy, and basically you're taking the best of what you think is the best, things that work for you, and the culture, the theology, and the history, and just claiming it independently of any existing denomination or power structure.
Yeah. And so we'll get into more of that in a little bit. But Rob wanted to lay the groundwork and set up sort of what was happening in the early 1800s.
Yeah, I think we were going to call this Joseph Smith's greatest hits.
Yeah.
And as we'll talk later, he had a lot of misses, a whole lot of misses too. But I think his hits were his theology and some of the ideas he put forth theologically. And as a Reformed Mormon, whether he got those directly from God, whether he came up with them on his own, whether he appropriated them from other sources or absorbed, I think, from the culture around him and the debates of the day, it doesn't matter. It's the ideas. Do the ideas make sense in light of the 21st century, in light of the Western move towards democracy and valuing individual rights? And so that's sort of what I think a lot of what he came up with in the speculative theology is right on target with those things. And that's what I'd like to talk about.
Right. And he was trying to solve conundrums in the religious world that was happening in the Protestant era.
Yeah, the Enlightenment American Enlightenment, I think, officially ended in 1815. And that's around the same time that the Second Great Awakening, from which evangelical Christianity emerged, but it was coming into fruition. So I thought maybe I'd start out basically laying out sort of what was the theology of the day in Christianity and monotheism. And it basically has not changed. There is a view of the nature of God that almost everybody in the Western world accepts almost by osmosis, whether you're a believer or not. When you say someone God, almost everybody, Europe, America, and any industrialized nation has this idea of what it is you mean.
That's right. It's a white-haired, bearded guy on a throne high up in the sky
or
knows everything.
Or this one, maybe not a white-haired guy in the sky, but there's the one power or source or force. There's this one thing that created everything. So I'll start maybe by looking at the definition of God, the established concept of a God here in the West, of what I call the established theological paradigm that we're all familiar with. Okay, one thing, there is only one God, and God is primary. God is the cause of everything that exists. God created everything from nothing. God is omnipotent. God is all powerful and controls everything. God is omnipresent. God is everywhere. He can't be confined to one place. God is not bound by the laws of physics. God is omniscient. God knows everything because God created everything. God controls everything. And so the past, the present, the future is all known by God because God controls it. God is all good. He's just. God is all loving, though not according to our human understandings of goodness, being loving or just, because we know that there are tons of things that happen in the world. The big theological conundrum for monotheism and Christianity is, if God is all good and just and loving and merciful, why do bad things happen to good people? And of course, that's a debate that humankind has wrestled with for thousands of years. God is beyond comprehension. Our consciousness was created by God. It has a beginning, and our consciousness will have an end. Our consciousness is completely different from God's consciousness. It is inferior. It's completely other than God's consciousness. So we cannot in any way ever comprehend God, which raises the question, how do we know that God is incomprehensible if we can't comprehend God?
Or in the form of a man, even.
And even when we envision him in a man or as a human incarnate, as Christianity does, there is still this belief that that's the human incarnation of God, but God is beyond that, and that we cannot comprehend God. And
right. He only comes in the form of a man so that we can comprehend him for the little while that he's communing with
right.
Moses. I mean, Moses says it's burning bush, but he also says he talked to the face of God, didn't he?
Oh yeah, which is again different, But then, and this is because this way of thinking about God is not necessarily the way the ancient Hebrews envisioned God. The ancient Hebraic conception of God was developed during the Iron Age. Most of what we know, especially Christianity, in fact, I would say Christianity as an established religion, as established theology, basically is the role of Hellenistic pagans trying to interpret Iron Age scripture, the Hebraic scriptures, in light of their philosophy and misunderstanding it and reading a lot of things into it. Because in the time of Christ and Paul and the first followers of Jesus, what scholars call the Jesus movement, they don't even call it Christianity, because Christianity, if you talk about Christianity in the first, second, third century, it's really almost anachronistic. In the first 100 years or so, the followers of Jesus they were Jews. It was a Jewish sect within greater Judaism, and it eventually became embraced by pagans through the ministry of like Paul, and Paul's version of things, which is highly Hellenistic, was embraced by them, and it basically morphed in what we are describing here, this monotheism. Even monotheism itself wasn't a concept back then. That phrase and word was invented in the 1660s. I mean, it's pretty recent vintage to describe this type of theology. Getting back to God, God is seen as sort of existing outside the confines of existence itself.
Like in another dimension.
Yeah, God created nature. God created everything. There's a really cute story that I think it's Rob Bell tells. And a father, a non-Christian father, was telling his daughter how, before God created everything, there was nothing. And the little child asked, so God created everything from nothing? So before God did that, there was nothing? So where did God stand while he was creating everything?
That's right.
Which the human mind this makes no sense. And
up to Joseph's time, there were basically philosophers and monks and preachers for 1,800 years, reformulating, rethinking, adding, subtracting.
Having to apologize for it. I mean, the word apologetics, which means trying to make sense or justify a belief, like apologizing. Something that you have to, an idea that you have to apologize for, that you have, right away, you should maybe be suspect of that. If you're having to apologize and contort reason to make sense of it, that seems like a giveaway if you're a rational person that maybe it's just wrong to begin with. But anyway, this idea of God existing outside the confines of reality, God created nature, God controls nature. And, we think of nature as being that which occurring naturally, means that it's not created. So in a sense, monotheism in Christianity says there's no such thing as nature. Everything is a creation of God. Right. God controls everything. God exists outside the confines of it. God is superior to nature. God is supernatural.
I suppose that's why paganism or worshiping nature is against Christianity. I never really thought of it that way until.
Yeah. And if you think of the ancients, the first human beings, they did not have this. They were what we call polytheists. They believed that there were many powers in the universe, each distinct, because they saw these different forces in nature, these different natures combating one another. And so to them, the world was pluralistic.
Yeah, like the rain god was in charge when it was raining, and then the sun god came out and battled the rain until it was sunny.
Right. And of course, then what they got into as well, then they even expanded beyond that. So you had gods of war and gods of peace and gods of fertility. And the gods were constantly in conflict with each other. And so the gods themselves had different natures. They had different personalities. They were as capricious as human beings. And so you didn't know which god you're going to piss off at any given time. So you better, Friday night, you better give a sacrifice to Athena. And then you maybe give a sacrifice to Zeus, because you don't want any of the gods jealous of each other. And there's still remnants of that in the Torah, where Yahweh says, "I am a jealous God. Have no other gods before me." He doesn't say you can have other. He doesn't say you can't have other gods, but don't put them before me.
That's right. So and there's a lot of I think it's called astrochronology, where they set up ancient temples as part of the spring and fall equinoxes and the summer and winter solstice. All those bode changes in the weather, different clues to planting or harvesting or storing up things.
And the idea that the gods, basically anciently the gods, and then with Christians that God created everything, it makes sense that primitive civilizations, ancient people would think about that, because how did they survive? They took the elements around them, they made things, they made tools, they manipulated the earth so that it would bring forth something. It made sense to them, probably, that since they were having to create things and organize things and basically and put their will on things around them, that existence itself was the product of that as well. That some higher being had done that to make the world.
And then there was the appearance of Christ and sort of the evolution that happened after that. The Christians of the early 1800s, my understanding is that each denomination thought you were well within any of the denominations, but we would rather you take our point of view.
And that's still the view of Catholics, Protestants, Eastern Orthodox. Yeah, they value their particular religions, their particular denomination, but the differences between the denominations are not theological. There might be a few tweaks here and there. They might debate certain things.
The basics are all covered.
The Southern Baptists have a different. Free will Baptists have a more accepting view of human agency and freedom than maybe Southern Baptists do. Tend to be more Calvinistic. Methodists have more belief in the potential for human goodness and perfectibility. So it's not just being saved. It's actually, once you're saved and have this conversion experience, then you begin a road of becoming sanctified. And and then there are others, the Catholic Church, Eastern Orthodox tradition. Sanctification comes through the sacraments and participating in the ordinances and things that their priests administer, and through communal living. And then there are others who just say, no, you just believe, and you're going to be saved, which means get to heaven when you die. But this whole way of thinking, these competing things, this evolved initially when Christianity became the dominant religion, the state religion of Rome, and then it was debated, and all these various Christian communities, aka churches, ecclesias, communities that had existed from that point 200 to 300 years separate from one another and had developed their own traditions. They came together, their leaders did, and they decided, after much debate, what Christian theology was. And this is really the birth of Christianity.
At the same time, they were trying to quiet heretics, right?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, basically, if you went against this understanding of one God, the big debate with that was, okay, if Christ is divine and the Holy Spirit, Holy Ghost is divine, then is that three gods or one God? That was the big debate. But the whole world at the time was polytheistic. They believed in many gods. People don't realize this. I mean, the various cultures had different names, but they were the same gods. They might have a different name for the supreme God or the head god,
like Zeus and Jupiter and whatever.
Right. In fact, when the Jews rebelled, when the Greeks, when the Greeks took over Jerusalem, and we have Hanukkah, and that was the Maccabees basically revolted because a pagan idol was set up in the Jerusalem temple by the Greeks. But the Greeks, their reasoning was, wait, you say that Yahweh is the head god. Well, okay, that's Zeus. Zeus and Yahweh are the same being. And so, I mean, we know you don't like statues of God, but we're going to put a statue of the supreme God. You call him Yahweh, we call him Zeus. We're going to put him in your temple.
Joseph Smith introduces this similar concept when he has his characters try to proselytize a king. And they says, do you know what God is? No, I don't know what God is.
The Great
Do you believe in the Great Spirit? Yeah. Right. Okay. It's the same guy.
Right. So there was a lot of cultural borrowing and switching of names. But once monotheism, for the first time in human history, the idea of one God, of monoism, of one source, one source, one creator of everything, became the state religion, then that began to be imposed everywhere. Polytheism very quickly evaporated in the West. You would have thought, okay, Christianity, one God, the Mediterranean, the Western world, that they're all agreeing on this. This should be a golden age. What happened? The Dark Ages. Because suddenly, if there's one thing controlling everything, one God, then that means that what does that mean about human beings? And this is basically the implications of that. If there is just one God, one force doing everything, creating everything, then natural laws are the creation of God. Natural laws can be broken or altered by God. So you can't really trust nature. Nature existence, even though we're conscious of it, is an experience. It's not primary. It didn't come first. Consciousness didn't come before, or our consciousness is different from God. God's consciousness created things. So you can't determine the truth of things by studying nature, because God's consciousness created and controls nature.
Sort of sets the stage for being anti-scientific.
Basically, mind over matter. At this point, it's God's mind that's over matter. And so mind comes first and matter comes second. And because God created existence, God's consciousness existed before everything. And the implications for human beings are that we're all creations of God. We can't exist independently of God. We're not autonomous in any way. We don't have agency. Agency, autonomy, individual freedom is either seen as a temporary gift that's given by God and can be taken away at his will, or it's simply an illusion, because we're just a creation of God. We don't control ourselves. We're not autonomous from him. To be human beings must submit to God's will. Individual willfulness is seen as rebellion against the one God. Individuality, it's an illusion, because one's existence depends upon God. One is not separate from God. So there is no such thing as the individual.
And unfortunately,
the individual survival is upon submitting totally to God.
To a believer, you're not really submitting to God. You're submitting to your pastor's interpretation of God and how they interpret the scriptures. And so that creates problems within all the denominations.
Every denomination, and that's true in the LDS Church. That's true in, I think, in current evangelical Christianity, which 30 years ago, 1/3 or 30% of Americans identified as born-again evangelical Christians, and they were the ones having the most children. Well, now look at this 30 years later. Those children are adults, and they are leaving evangelical Christianity as quickly, even more quickly, than LDS youth and young people are leaving the LDS Church.
That's right, the rise of the nuns.
Right. And okay, so why is this? And this is very similar to actually what was happening in America in the 1750s. People don't realize this, but at the time of the Revolutionary War, only 1 in 10 Americans was active in a church. Now,
that was the age of reason, and it's also called enlightenment.
Exactly. And this is what we're getting to. So this monotheism, which basically it really denies. Christianity denies the reality of nature. It denies the reality of the individual, and therefore of individual freedom and liberty. Those are just illusions. Things began to change in the Renaissance when artists began discovering pagan concepts of beauty, the beauty of the human body, of the physical world, of physical nature. When art began showing pagan myths and even biblical myths. A lot of the biblical artwork from the Renaissance looks very pagan. You could almost look at it and think that you're looking at an illustration of a pagan myth, because they usually show
dualism.
Dualism. The human being is struggling against God, or it's Samson struggling with a lion, or it's Jacob wrestling with an angel, or it's David wrestling and slaying Goliath. It's conflict, and it's this idea of there's beauty in an individual human being exerting his or her will against another human being or something else, or against the forces of nature. That resonated with people because that's the nature of human existence. And there was beauty in that. So that began to become celebrated during the Renaissance. And then the philosophy of Aristotle reemerged in the West, and which really emphasized reasoning and logic as the key to survival and happiness, not just submitting to some Platonic ideal and a god or ideal that exists outside of existence, which is very much in line with monotheism. And
lots of the thinkers in early science appear in the 1600s
exactly.
and 1700s.
And who fought the scientists? The monotheists, Christianity, the people with this that embrace monism. They did not want to believe that the scriptures, which were the infallible word of their one God, could be wrong about something as self-evident as the earth, as the sun seeming to rise over the earth, and therefore the sun goes around the earth, not vice versa. So that they had invested interest in keeping God outside of nature and in control of nature, and not trying to make sense of nature by observation.
And it was sort of like it's not hubris isn't the word, but sort of a natural thing to think if humans are God's ultimate creation, and this is the only place, Earth is the only place that he has a family that he's created and he's watching over. And so to think that there's other worlds and other, potential beings out there, sometimes for some people went against, but some people were accepting it.
You have that in the Bible, in the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, the Tanakh, which is a lot of that was that imagery came from the Iron Age, and they saw the world very differently. The earth was flat. At the edge of the flat earth, there were a range of mountains, the pillars of heaven, and they held a dome. The sky was actually a ceiling, a dome. And the various lights were lamps, the stars, the moon, the suns. These were creations. These were lamps up in the heaven. Above heaven was water, below the earth was water, and if God wanted to flood the water, then he opened the floodgates underneath, so they had rivers, streams, and floods and seas, or he opened the windows of heaven and rain fell down. Then you got to the time of Jesus, and this was where a Greek view of the world, and the world there was the earth, which was flat, but then there were spheres above it. And the earth was material, it was dense, it was corruptible. And as you ascended higher into basically 7 or more layers of heaven, matter changed. It became more refined. And basically, if you could ascend that high, if the various gods would allow you to ascend that high and didn't stop you, your body would have to go some sort of change. It would have to be refined in order to ascend up to the highest God, the God above and beyond comprehension. And so that's why you see in the New Testament, Jesus ascending into heaven, because they believed he ascended beyond the clouds and kept going higher and higher until he reached the highest place where God was, the God of all gods.
That's right.
And again, in Joseph Smith's day, we knew the earth went around the sun. One of the main little things that he sticks in the Book of Mormon is, and we know the earth goes around the sun. I mean, that's right. Actually stuck in the Book of Mormon. So by the time Joseph Smith was born, we knew physical existence was totally different from physical existence as imagined by or envisioned by the writers of the New Testament and the writers of the Hebrew Bible. And they were incompatible unless you took those writings as sort of mythology or as based upon the understanding that the people had at that time, and then tried to find meaning into them in that way. You could do that, but that's not what the various churches wanted to do. They basically hunkered down on biblical literalism and to know this is the way it is. But then
it's biblical literalism, but redefined in each individual thing. And so
exactly,
this shows about how Joseph Smith saw those differences and created or was inspired to sort of tie some loose ends together, because my whole idea for the show is that there's a lot of people who leave the church and they throw it all away. But what was it in 1830 that attracted people to Joseph Smith?
Plus, what was it that motivated him? This is why I think Dan Vogel's book, The Making of a Prophet, is by far the best biography written of Joseph Smith so far, because he lays out the facts. I mean, you don't find a better documented book about Joseph Smith's first 25 years than Making of a Prophet. But he also, in those facts, he basically looks rationally at what would a human being in this situation, why would that human being be doing this? And he makes some suggestions. And
family problems.
Yeah, and family problems. And what was the number one thing dividing Joseph Smith's family, besides the fact that they had started out pretty much as upper middle class, a couple, and then lost everything. And also the fact that Lucy probably struggled with depression, and Joseph Smith Sr. was an alcoholic.
They lost a brother.
They lost a brother. But even before that, there was this divide within the family. Lucy Mack Smith was very much a monotheist. She was a Christian. She was a Calvinist. And she lived in fear. She believed in this God outside of nature who might reveal himself supernaturally, because he was supernatural in dreams, or maybe in the folk magic and traditions that they inherited, which were at one with Christianity in that part of the United States at that time.
And maybe you had to be precise in your obedience to the different commandments.
Right,
where
exactly.
Joseph Sr. was like a universalist, right?
Exactly. He was
we're
a
all
rationalist.
Going back to heaven.
Yeah. And also, he basically, I remember he, early in his marriage, he was going, Lucy Magda convinced him to start going with her to visit, to a local Methodist circuit rider came through and was holding meetings. And when Joseph Smith Sr. father found out that his son was going to a Methodist camp meeting with his wife, the story in the family was that he wrote up, had a copy of The Age of Reason by Thomas Paine, who was a deist, basically threw it into the house and said, read it and keep reading until you believe it, and then wrote away. And Thomas Paine, of course, very much in his books questioned the veracity, the historicity of the Bible. He proposed something, a theory of the Bible, which actually is upheld by the text itself and by modern scholarship, says that most of what we have in the Torah was probably a priestly forgery during the reign of King Josiah. So basically, it says in the Bible that they went into the sort of the deserted or the forsaken, neglected temple of Yahweh in Jerusalem, and they found the scrolls of the law. And they showed those to King Mosiah, who was a child, and said, this has been lost. We should have been doing this all along. And according to the Bible, that's when Passover started being celebrated and the various festivals and things. Well, Paine said, well, this was just forgery, priestly forgery. And that's how Judaism, what became Second Temple Judaism, really, that was the roots of it. And
what do you call it when you write in the name of some other prophet?
Pseudepigrapha. And most of the Bible is pseudepigraphic. You know, in Isaiah, they think the first 26, 30 chapters probably came from the pre-Babylonian period by someone named Isaiah, or at least attributed by somebody named Isaiah. But the rest of the books come from two other periods. Deutero Isaiah, Trito Isaiah, they came decades after the Jews returned, to Jerusalem. And so there was this whole idea that the Bible itself is open to debate. And the Protestant Reformation really brought that about, because Protestantism was saying, basically backing away from organized religion, the organized churches, and saying that the individual, in a way, they were acknowledging the individual has some autonomy here, and the individual has to have a personal relationship with God. They can't be dependent upon priests or rituals or being part of an organization or a community to make them right with God. They actually have to submit to God personally. And that's the roots of Protestantism and of evangelicalism. And that was, of course, the religion of Joseph's time. But before that came the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment view was that basically nature is real. God may have created nature, But then God put the natural laws in order, and God stepped back and let it go like a clock. Same with human beings. God may have created or originated human beings, but there is human nature, and he sat back and he gave them free will, and they are free to do what they want. And the way that a human being survives is they have to observe objective reality around them. They have to look at nature. They have to use reason. They have to use logic. And God gave them the freedom to do that. It's inherent in their nature. And so every human being is an individual. They have individual rights that are inherent in their nature. God didn't give it to them. They came from God through nature. And the enlightened thinkers talked about nature's God, or the God of nature. And that was very ambiguous on purpose. A Christian could say, okay, they're talking about the God of the Bible.
Right.
Most of the time, what they meant was the God who created nature, or the divinity that is revealed through nature, that nature itself is God. Nature itself, existence, is primary, not consciousness.
It's called the second great awakening. That's, in a way, the religionists fight back against the age of enlightenment.
Exactly.
In a way, I would reverse those names. Enlightenment seems like something that would be a knowledge from above. Right. And awakening would seem like you're awakened to the physical surroundings. And so I think it's
such a beautiful point. That's exactly it. Because, I mean, again, when Christianity, when monotheism became the religion of the Western world, and with the emergence of Islam, which is even more hunkers down on its monotheism than Christianity, I mean, what was the result? Again, the Dark Ages. And when did the Dark Ages go away? When people rediscovered pagan thought and this idea of pluralism. And that was the whole thing with the Enlightenment. Its view of the world was pluralistic. There is nature. Things that exist have competing natures, different natures. In a way, it was a return to the view of the first human beings, of this. There are many things that work in the universe. One thing does not control everything. We can't say that. And nature is supreme. Right. Nature, if we're conscious, to be conscious, you got to be conscious of something. So something, existence comes first, and consciousness either arises or is inherent in existence, or it arises from existence, but it doesn't come before existence.
Right. And I think we're in like the second great enlightenment. Right. As a way of
fighting the second great awakening. I love the way you redefine those terms.
Yeah. So that sort of stems from, like, if you think about it, in the 20th century, scientists, a lot of them were driven by their belief of God.
Yeah.
And now we're in the 21st century. There doesn't have to be a belief in God anymore. And there doesn't have to be a fixed religion. You could still be spiritual, but not part of a religion.
Right. Unfortunately, the conflict remains that most people's spirituality is basically embedded in some form of monism, of monotheism. The idea that, okay, even despite everything at the end, all matter, all the diversity of elements that we know are in the universe. I mean, from the very beginning, human beings realized that there were competing things. There were things with different natures. So the ancient Greeks, they had earth, wind, fire, water as the elements. And of course, with the age of science, we have now determined that there are so many elements, and we'll probably discover as we go into space and all that there are other elements that we don't know of yet. But the idea that there are fixed elements with fixed natures, and there are many things that comprise what we see as reality, and the reality existence is not dependent on any one of those things. That's because the Western world tends to still have a monotheistic reference with spirituality, they still struggle with that. Yeah. I say Joseph Smith, and also next to him probably people like Parley P. Pratt, some of the first Mormon theologians, and are people who thought theologically. They introduced a theology, a speculative theology that actually resonates with the Enlightenment. And I say that Mormon theology, early Mormon theology, this is not the theology of the LDS Church. This is not necessarily the theology of Brigham Young or Utah, but that first 14 years, first few months to the first 14 years or so, Yeah, there was a foundation for another theology. And Joseph Smith started as a Christian. The Book of Mormon, we know that what we have is the Book of Mormon. Actually, he dictated basically Mosiah to the end first. And when you get to Mosiah and Alma, the theology is very Christian. There are some concessions to human individuality and freedom. Because if you think about it,
I heard someone say that that King Benjamin, a lot of those would resonate with the Methodist preachers of the day.
Okay, yeah, I mean, I grew up Methodist, and the Book of Mormon is primarily a Wesleyan document because Wesley believed once you had this awakening of your heart, it was called heart religion. You had an emotional reaction to the goodness of God, to goodness, to the Spirit. And you basically repented. You were convicted of the things that were not good. You were cruel. You were unjust. It wasn't just being an inherent sinner. It was your personal sins, the things you did wrong in your life. Those come back, and you face up to those, and you face up. You admit to those. You have a come to Jesus moment. Invite the Spirit in, and then throughout the rest of your life, the Spirit of God, which is loving, which is just, merciful, gracious, and honest, basically starts to transform the human heart and sanctify it so that you basically become perfect like Jesus.
So Joseph's teachings evolved a little bit. What were the first teachings what were the first things that he was trying to resolve?
I think the first thing was, what basically all Americans, and even today, American Christians, evangelical and the American atheists, are trying to resolve, and that is, we come from a country. What is our founding document? The Declaration of Independence. What does it say? All men are created equal. They are endowed by their Creator with certain rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Okay, that's a very positive view of human nature. Now, Christianity, and especially American Christianity, says the opposite. They embrace original sin, which is not that we all do things bad, not that we all sin, but that human nature itself is inherently contrary to God's nature. It is inherently, because we have a human will, because we think for ourselves, because any form of human willfulness is evidence that we are inherently corrupt, because Adam and Eve ate the fruit. And even if those Christians who now basically don't believe in literal Adam and Eve, but take that as a myth, they still hold this idea of human, because humans are not perfect, because they sin, they are inherently alienated from God. They have, in God's eyes, no rights to anything. They deserve to go to hell. They deserve damnation, and they can't try to work their way out of it. They can't try to do good things and get out of it, because anything they do, any good work they do, it's temporary. It comes from basically a polluted well, and a polluted well can't give forth good water. And therefore, anything human beings do, it's doomed to failure, regardless of how good their intentions. The only thing they can do is just admit they're totally evil, sinful, and they throw themselves on the mercy of God.
And only following Jesus.
The good news of Christianity. If you do that, if you completely abase yourself before the supernatural God, who you can't understand, who you will never understand. If you give up your autonomy, if you give up your freedom, if you actually give up this idea that you have any rights to anything, particularly happiness, then you'll be saved. With those two ideas, the Declaration of Independence, opening clause, Christian orthodoxy, original sin, Jonathan Edwards' famous American sermon were sinners in the hands of an angry God, which hunkered down on original sin. Augustinian theology, Calvinism, are all about the complete depravity of human nature. So you have that among American Christians. At the same time, they're embracing enlightenment thought, deistic thought. All human beings are created equal and are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, including freedom and the right to pursue happiness. That is so, there is no way to reconcile those two viewpoints. So that, in a nutshell, is what Joseph Smith and every American Christian was facing at that point, and even today. And that is why, because society has gone the way of the Declaration of Independence. We believe in human rights. All the sociological debate, all the debates in society are about the rights of someone being denied because either their race, their gender, their religion, their nationality, their social standing. That's been basically social activism and politics have revolved around that battle for 200 years.
So what
Because
was the
we
first thing?
acknowledge the reality and the value of the individual and their
So
freedom and their rights.
what were the first things that Joseph Smith was doing to attract followers to solve some of those problems?
Well, you find buried treasure.
Well, that's how he got some authority. But as far as like the religion, when did he start solving some of these problems?
And this is the paradox with Joseph Smith. And because I do believe the Book of Mormon, and here's where I come from. I accept the Book of Mormon as scripture. It was totally fiction. Because for me, scripture can is literature from which you derive meaning, sacred meaning. And to me, the Book of Mormon does that. It's not
Thoreau is a prophet.
Exactly. Well, yes, this is it. So many of the writers who were the thinkers that were coming into being immediately after the American Enlightenment, in the same age as Joseph Smith, Thoreau, Emily Dickinson, Hawthorne, Washington Irving, all of this creative output that was coming forth in America was at the same time as the Second Great Awakening. Transcendental meditation, the Transcendentalists, were coming forth at the same time that the Mormons and the Adventists and these various utopian communities were coming forth. And Mormonism, initially began in Kirtland as an utopian community, much like the ones that were being founded by the Shakers and the free love community up in Maine. They were all basically challenging the norms of the time and trying to find something that I think resonated with some aspects of Enlightenment rational thinking. So Joseph Smith, if we're going to go with his greatest hits, I'll just give you a list of things that a person could look at, because I think as far as what his output, these are his greatest hits. Second Nephi chapter 2. I mean, that's where you get about the fall of Adam and Eve. D&C section 88 called the Olive Branch. And that was December 27th, 1832. It is revolutionary. In terms of what it is rejecting in monotheism and in Christianity. D&C 93, which came just a few months later. That's where he learned that the mind of man and intelligence was not created. God could not create intelligence. Man was in the beginning with God. Again, this is rejecting monotheism. It's using Christian language. And for instance, in D&C 93, he takes sort of the symbolism in the language of the opening chapter of the Gospel of John. And the Gospel of John is different from the other three in that it presents Jesus as having been divine before he was born, as having existed with God before he was born. You don't find that in the other three Gospels. You don't even find that necessarily in the writings of Paul, although theologians infer that. That's in the Gospel of John. Well, Joseph Smith takes that imagery that until then Christianity is reserved only for Jesus, and he applies it to every single human being. So that in a sense, every single human being ontologically is the equal of Christ. Again, complete heresy.
Everyone can be a savior on Mount Zion.
Well, yeah, or
eventually.
Actually, when you get into biblical scholarship, secular biblical scholarship about what Paul meant, not necessarily Paulian theology is developed after Paul. Paul very much sort of, when he talks about Jesus being the first fruits, Paul's idea was, at any minute now, Christ is going to come back. There's going to be this universal resurrection. And those of us who accepted the reality of Jesus's resurrection and are following him, we're going to be formed into what he is. We'll be raised up and we'll be transformed into his image and we'll be just like him. So that there is even elements of that throughout the New Testament in Paul's writing. Eastern Orthodoxy grasps onto that. Catholicism, Protestantism backs away from it. But another thing, I would say the seventh lecture on faith, which basically defines what God is. And it defines God as a saved being. And this is what I love. The great prototype of all saved beings. So it's re-envisioning God as a prototype for human potential. This is what all of us can potentially become. And then, of course, there's the King Fayed Discourse, which was one of his last sermons just a few months before he died. And his followers, the majority of Mormons, had problems with that. So much so that his last sermon, just a few weeks or weeks before he was arrested, was defending the plurality of gods, defending polytheism. Now, that's a huge journey to go from dictating in 1829 parts of the Book of Alma, where they say there's only one God, to defending polytheism. There are many gods, and his argument was, once you see the beauty of this, you'll understand what I'm talking about. And also, why would somebody who's running for president start teaching polytheism? I say it's because polytheism is basically a theology that's based on pluralism, and democracy is pluralistic. It's pagan. The Greeks invented democracy. A pagan culture created democracy.
So as a voter, I am like God.
Well, exactly, because what we all know, and the thing is, we all know this. If we sit back and wait for God to come and intervene in our lives, we go nowhere. We have to exert our will. We have to make decisions. We have to act based on what reason tells us. Most of us, regardless of how devout we are, regardless, I don't care if you're a fundamentalist, a biblical literalist, whatever your religion is, you get through day-to-day living not by faith in God, but by faith in yourself and in your ability to reason.
And here's how I think about that right now is, so I say that I have faith that I'm going to get on an airplane and then it's going to go to a destination. It's something that hasn't happened yet, but there's lots of proof that the company has been doing it.
And why do we fly? As long as we were trying to make wings for ourselves and jump off of things, we were killing ourselves. When we discovered gravity and force and the physics involved, then by observing and studying and understanding reality and the forces, not the one force, but the many forces that play against one another in nature, we were able to come up with the airplane and the spaceship and all of this and transcend the bonds of gravity, using natural laws to our advantage. And that's what survival is. And we all know that. We all know it. When we get sick, we might call in the elders for a prayer and for a blessing. You might pray to God.
Community. It's a great community get together, right?
It actually is. And giving somebody a blessing is a wonderful way for you as an individual, I think, to express your love and concern for that person. But most of us go to a doctor. We might pray to God. We might have in our churches prayer groups or prayer warriors and also praying that we'll be cured for cancer. And we may honestly believe that and pray for that, but we're still going to go to an oncologist. Most people are still going to get chemotherapy. Most people are still going to have the cancer removed. Why? Because when it comes right down to it, we do believe in the reality of nature. We do believe that human beings can reason and think, that human beings have agency and can make a difference in the world, and that human beings can understand nature, that it is not some mysterious mystery that God created and controlled, but that we can understand it, and through understanding it, control aspects of it in order that we can survive, prosper, flourish, and progress.
And so, Rob, what do you get from Joseph Smith preaching the plurality of gods as something that resonates with you, other than being able to
let me go back. I'll just lay some of the theological points. Okay. So what he taught was the elements are eternal. Again, they weren't created by God. They weren't created by anybody. They're
God
eternal.
Just organized them.
Right. There is no such thing as creation. Joseph Smith eventually threw out the entire word creation. He went from accepting that God was creator of all things, which was basically implied from reading the first chapter of Genesis, even the first verse of Genesis, the most famous. We know from the King James Version or some version of the King James Version. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. However, go to the actual translation from in Judaism that's in the Tanakh, and it's in the current modern day English translation of the Tanakh. And it's when God began creating the earth and sky, the earth was without form and void, with a wind from God blowing over it. And God said, let there be light. So even in the Hebrew Bible, creation doesn't happen ex nihilo. There's Yahweh, there's God. And
acting on things that exist.
He acts upon things that exist. He organizes it. So Joseph goes from God as creator and Alma of all things to Abraham with the gods organizing the pre-existing eternal elements. I'm sorry, there's no, that resonates. As pagan and as polytheistic, that resonates with the reality of what we know reality is, much more than monotheism, that God creates everything from nothing. It acknowledges the supremacy of existence over consciousness. A conscious entity acts on existence. It is conscious of existence. It doesn't create existence. So, I mean, that's a huge difference.
And polytheism is inherent to the exaltation of man in a way, right?
Yeah. Another thing, and this is in Second Nephi, opposition in all things. Now, usually most Latter-day Saints, most Mormons say, okay, there's opposition to all things. You know, you have good and you have bad. But if you look at the list of things that Joseph lists in Second Nephi, and I mean, and this part of Second Nephi is probably the most profound theological, philosophical part in the Book of Mormon. And it actually establishes the context from which you then are supposed to understand everything else that comes after in the Book of Mormon. If you look at that, he's talking about opposition in everything. It doesn't mean that this exists, this is bad, this is good, this is real, this is false. It's that everything has opposition in it.
Like yin and yang.
What is a molecule? Protons, neutrons. They're opposing forces that hold it together.
Negative and positive.
Yeah, I mean, so this is just inherent in existence, and it's
husband and wife. No, I'm just kidding.
And it's saying you can't have one without the other. And he says you can't have happiness without misery. You can't have life without death. You know, there is no such thing as, and with the elements being eternal, there's no such thing as non-existence. Existence just exists. This idea, when did existence begin? What are you talking about? Existence just is. You know, nobody created existence. Existence is what is. There's always been existence in some form. Even the Big Bang says that, you know, before the Big Bang, that's, you know, the theories that created everything that we know, that we can observe right now in existence. But even that, all the matter and everything, all the energy was still at a singular point of singularity, and then it burst forward. So even that existed before the Big Bang. So even science does not, in no way, accepts creation ex nihilo, or the idea that there can be immaterial matter. Again, something that Joseph Smith rejected. You know, we know now that where there seems to be an emptiness, that there is something called dark matter. And then this dark matter that we can't see, that seems to be in everything, seems to be what is sort of holding everything together. Well, that resonates really well with Joseph Smith's idea of light of Christ intelligence. That there is this energy from the bosom of eternity that's going through everything. That's the law by which everything is governed, that sort of is holding everything in place. The light of Christ. I mean, when you read those descriptions, and that is in those two sections of the D&C 80 and 93, a lot of that really sounds like he's trying to describe something that he's imagining that resonates a lot with what scientists are describing when they're trying to describe dark matter. Mm-hmm.
You mentioned at the beginning of the show that there were some misses, and I was just wondering if there's any more hits that are still on your list that we should.
There is. Let me get to a few more. Let me get to
the misses.
So human individuality, according to Mormon theology, to Joseph Smith's theology, there's opposition in all things. The mind of man is eternal, no beginning or end. Human individuality is real. It's not an illusion. Human freedom is real. It's not an illusion. God never had the power to create, the power, the intelligence, the mind of man. Therefore, the individual is completely autonomous from God. God is the great prototype for human beings. Salvation is becoming like God. God was once as we are now. God is a saved being. God became God by using his or her agency, by gaining knowledge, the same as we must, the same as all gods must. Truth is a knowledge of things as they were, are, and is. Truth is a knowledge of existence. There is no truth beyond existence. Truth is comprehending nature. It's comprehending what exists outside of you, what you're conscious of. It's objective. There is such a thing as an objective reality. And if human beings are to survive, we know this, they have to conform to the laws of reality. And Joseph Smith, even gods have to do that. No intelligent being can escape nature, can escape objective reality. They can only engage with it and deal with it on its terms. And they do that by thinking in terms of opposition, by naming things, by understanding things, and then by acting as autonomous, intelligent, free agents. The body and then the mind or the soul of man, that's something that Joseph Smith said. This idea, and this exists even in LDS thinking, this idea, oh, your spirit is what's real, your body is illusionary. But he said, no, the soul and the spirit and the body
reconnect.
When they're in somebody joy, bring a fullness of joy. That's the soul of man. Your soul, your body is as much your soul as your spirit. Another philosopher put it this way, basically the body without the spirit is a corpse. The spirit without the body is a ghost. Either way, you're talking death. What is God's highest value according to what we read in Moses? This is my life and my purpose, my work and my glory to bring about the immortality, eternal life of man, which says that the highest divine value is human life. It's human survival. It's human flourishing. That's what it's all about. That is the whole point of the divine is that.
And I hearken to some of the Greek mythology where the gods are consuming grapes, fruits of either humans' labor, and people are sacrificing food maybe to the gods, sometimes, which is really to the priests. You hear like nectar of the gods, wine and stuff like that. So in a way, our being physical and a spirit in heaven helps us to taste and to experience these types of joyous engagements with things like that. Even
Joseph Smith even said a person with a being with a body has much more power than a disembodied spirit. This is a step forward.
But even helps you enjoy, let's say, marital relations with plural wives. Maybe.
And then this is it, because of this positive view of the human body, which Mormonism initially had. Parley P. Pratt in 1840 wrote a fantastic a missionary tract in England called Intelligence and Affection, which intelligence is basically a euphemism for thinking, for being rational thought. Affection was a euphemism for natural desires, biological urges, sex. And the whole point of this thing is do not embrace denial of your sexuality. Do not, all the monks and all the nuns throughout history, they were miserable for no reason. God wants you to embrace your natural affections and cultivate them. In fact, he said something that 20th century LDS general pop authorities would go apoplectic about. He said, do not pray that God decreases your sexual urges. Pray that they are increased, that he increases them and gives you the knowledge and wisdom of how to use them so that those around you, so that you solidify your relationship with your loved ones and that you become a blessing to the people that you love. So it's this very positive, radical view of human sexuality.
Almost like hedonism is part of God's eternal plan.
Yeah, except it wasn't hedonism because he said that there are bounds to this.
You can't just love things for loving things. You'd have to be part of the human connection.
It has to be a thing of building community. Now, I think that I don't think that we understand. I still don't think that we have any idea what was going on sexually in Nauvoo. I tend to think Parley P. Pratt, Brigham Young, Herbert Kimball, when they were over in England and being exposed to free love communities, and that was an English thing, the Lord Byron, the writer of Frankenstein, all of these writers at the time, they embraced free love. And that was being embraced in places in the U.S. as well. But then you had also British sects who were experimenting with things too, just like you had it in America. And I tend to think that those apostles, because Parley P. Pratt was amazing. He basically took the ideas in these sections that Joseph I read a little bit back, and he really built upon that and really developed Mormon theology into something that was totally different from Christianity. I think that Joseph Smith inspired Parley P. Pratt. I think Parley P. Pratt's writings got Joseph Smith thinking. I think they fed off of one another. So that but when you are preaching the beauty of the human body and the beauty of sex and how it's this wonderful thing that can bond you to your loved ones and be a blessing to everyone who comes into your life, it's very easy then to start transcending established social bounds, which may be a good thing or a bad thing. But it's also very easy to take advantage of that. And I think that is what happened in Nauvoo.
Joseph was preaching that the community in heaven should be like the community on earth. Like, did he say something like, I'd rather go to hell with my friends than be in heaven where I wasn't having a good time?
Well, exactly. I'll be honest. When I read that years ago, he said, if we go to hell, if we're wrong, we go to hell, we'll kick the devil out and we'll make a heaven of the place.
Right. There you go.
What a celebration of not even the devil. Joseph Smith starts out in the Book of Mormon. You have this very traditional, almost Calvinist idea, Christian idea of the devil, the opponent. And then that sort of resonated get repeated again, but sort of starts to alter in December of 1830 and February of 1831, where he's dictating what we have as the Book of Moses, where suddenly the devil is
playful gambler.
Yeah, but it's not just he wants to be God. He wants to. What's the devil sent? According to the Mormon myth, it's that he wants to force people to be good.
All right.
Take away their agency. I'll force them to be good, and not one of them will be lost.
Which is actually why, in a way, I sort of started to not believe in the topper leaders of the church, because it seems like all the edicts from on high are trying to force people to be good instead of letting people be human.
Joseph Smith famously said, I teach correct principles and let the people govern themselves. And he did do that to a greater degree than a lot of post-Mormons, anti-Mormons want to admit. Once he died, and sort of the community and the organization in Nauvoo and the various, because there were still existing congregations in Kirtland and places. Mormons never really left any place. There were always still Latter-day Saints left behind who were continuing to identify and practice as Latter-day Saints. But when the Nauvoo stake, basically, the governing stake of the whole enterprise, dissolved in the weeks following Joseph Smith's death, and William Marks, who really was the top authority in Nauvoo, because under Joseph Smith, the stake high council was the highest authority in the church. And the first presidency of the priesthood was equal in authority. But things basically, regardless of where you were, your local high council was the final authority in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints under Joseph Smith. That all changed under Brigham Young. Radio Free Mormon, I think, did a fantastic episode called Brigham Young's Coup. Look it up, Google it. Yeah, I think that is the most informative
apostolic. I'll include that as a link in the description.
Yeah. Because what they did, they reorganized the church. The apostles had no authority anywhere. They were a traveling high council. Their only authority was over the 70s. And if one was called to be a missionary, one was ordained a 70. Not an elder. If you were an elder, you were then ordained to 70. You were then under the dictates of the 12 apostles, and they only had authority if there were Latter-day Saints in a particular area, and there weren't enough to have
a branch or
local high council. Then they became the traveling high council to come in and settle disputes. And of course, what Brigham Young did, he ordained everybody. They ordained everybody. Everyone ordained 70s. So you had no elders, no deacons, no priests.
If you think about their traveling to handle disputes, they're still letting people act for themselves and only come in to resolve disputes, not to dictate what everybody's learning or thinking.
And so really, if you look at Community of Christ, the way they have things set up, it is much closer to the church in Joseph Smith's time, because local congregations have autonomy. Local congregations, they now call their bishops pastors. The local congregation, they elect by democratic vote who their bishop's going to be, who their pastor is going to be. And then representatives from those congregations, they basically vote by democratic process who is going to represent them on the other levels of the church, all the way up to the president of the church. That is very much the model that existed in Joseph Smith's time. Joseph Smith wanted to boot Sidney Rigdon. out of the first presidency. He had enough. He put it to the saints, to the church for a vote, and they voted not to, because the majority of Latter-day Saints at that point in Nauvoo still highly revered Sidney Rigdon. He was, after Joseph Smith, the second most visible church leader. Next to him would probably be William Marks. The fame, the authority of the 12 apostles was only in the mission field, only over in England, only over where there were no organized big branches.
Right. So the members who are in stakes were led by stake leaders.
Who they elected, who they chose by common consent, appointed or accepted. They had to accept the leadership. And when the saints said, no, we are not kicking Sidney Rigdon out of the first presidency, Joseph Smith said, fine, have it your way, but I wash my hands of the man. I've had it.
This is like fodder for another show someday. But I remember
what all this shows is that there was this that basically Mormonism actually had a strong democratic core, not only in its practice, but theologically. And I would say that theologically, this theology of Joseph Smith of early Mormonism, which is not the theology of LDS Church, or necessarily, or certainly not the Community of Christ, is actually the only theology that I've ever come across that I think supports democracy, that supports reason, because according to this, I'm not dependent upon God. I'm not dependent upon somebody else's authority. The early Mormon view of priesthood was that it was charismatic. It was inherent. Even in, I think, Alma chapter 18, when they describe priesthood, they talk about how everyone before the foundations of the world, it was God's will that everyone have this priesthood.
And charisma, in a way, is just your brain going through a process of thinking what might be a good thing and then putting it out there.
And acknowledging it. Basically, somebody says something, or their personality, or their looks, or whatever, or maybe their position, you then imbue them with some sort of connection that means something to you. Joe, when I was a kid, I saw Billy Graham preach. He came to this area of Virginia. He was an entertainer. I mean, he was physically, he was a beautiful human being when he was young. I mean, he had at that point gray hair, but these piercing blue eyes. I was sitting in a huge auditorium with probably 8,000 people in it, and he was down on a podium, and with the light, you could still see his physical presence. Joseph Smith, especially if we look at this late, the daguerreotype that was discovered, which I tend to think was Joseph Smith. First time I saw it, I went, huh? The more I look at it, I think it's him. He was ruggedly good looking. And sort of the traditional LDS depiction of him, which I always thought looked sort of like a parrot. He looked bird-like. He looked more like Liberace, I thought, when I first saw him when I was investigating the church. And when I looked at this prototype, I think he looks more like Burt Lancaster or some really hunky 1940s rough, athletic build leading man from Hollywood.
I think somebody said he saw one of those portraits that the church uses and didn't like it, thought it was too boyish or something like that.
I mean, Emma said that when he saw the image, and there's some debate now because since this came out, now that there is a theory, and it seems to hold water with a lot of people, that maybe the famous painting of him and Emma were actually done from daguerreotypes and later
and stylized.
Died. And that but whatever, the first image that was produced of Joseph, whether it was that painting or whether it was the daguerreotype, and one of the things that struck me too was the curled hair. I mean, Emma got a curling iron that morning and curled his hair in that picture. And that necktie is spread out to show all the ruffles. I could see somebody who grew up in the frontier and thought of himself as a prophet and sort of a powerful, and who knew that he had charisma, that he had certainly an attraction for women, could look at that and think, wow, I look like a silly little boy. And I think that was his thing. That doesn't look like a prophet, looks more like a silly young boy, is what he said.
Not a rugged, on the edge of the frontier leader.
Who'd been, tarred and feathered and beaten up and had been close to starving while he was growing up, and had terrible leg surgery that crippled him, and yet was still able to make his way in this rough and tumble world of the West. So,
Rob, I really enjoy talking to you, and I could talk for hours. Sometimes, though, viewers can't watch for hours unless it's a Mormon Stories episode. Then they know they can come back to it on their next long drive or something like that.
Well, I say that the Joseph misses were basically when he tried to hang on to aspects of Christian theology and make them work, and they can't really be combined. I think the Mormon theology, the theology of Joseph Smith, the story is not Christian. I don't identify as a Christian. I identify as a Reformed Mormon. My theology is not monotheistic. It is not Christian. It is based on pluralism. It is polytheistic or henotheistic, but and it believes in the autonomy and the supremacy of the individual. The misses were basically organizational and trying to keep things, preaching this very liberal, liberating theology, but then realize if you take it to the extremes, you got to have some checks and balances. And very quickly, the checks and balances became a hierarchy and ways of having to fight dissent by trying to impose your will, even though
and I think maybe a miss. Everybody knows about the bank failure, but the miss might have been.
And if you read Dan Fogle's book, Joseph Smith lost more money in that than anyone else. He lost the most.
But the miss was probably conflating being a prophet with being a bank manager.
Exactly. We know when LDS argue, the Book of Mormon, if they could prove that the Book of Mormon is historical and that Joseph dug up plates and that an angel and that he divinely inspired, was divinely translated them into what we have as the Book of Mormon, that still doesn't mean anything as far as the LDS Church has claimed. That still doesn't mean that he was right about priesthood or his theology or any of the claims that he made about the church or himself, or that the church makes about him. You have to examine each idea independently, and you have to look at what you know, at reality. Does this theology, does what you believe resonate with what you know? That's my thing. If my theology doesn't resonate with what I know, then I got to reject it.
Were there some, let's say, advances that Brigham Young taught, or some of the misses that it lead to people leaving the church back then? I mean,
the biggest thing,
polygamy.
Well, polygamy, but the theology that justified polygamy. Again, Joseph Smith's thing was the individual was not created by God, has always existed, that it co-equal with God. And even in the King Follia Discourse, the climax of that discourse is actually omitted from most LDS versions. And that is the vision of infants on thrones. The idea that in the resurrection, an infant is resurrected and they will always stay an infant. But because they had the intelligence of a God, they are now sitting. Eternity is filled with thrones upon which
the same body they died with,
as gods in this infant's body, but they have the intelligence of a God. Resonates with what he's saying throughout things. You have to learn how to be a God. It's based on intelligence. It's based on knowledge, not about your body size, and certainly not about. Nowhere did he teach, as B.H. Roberts did later, that no, in the resurrection, these babies will actually grow up. No, Joseph's whole point is no, they never grow. They never change. It doesn't matter. It's the intelligence that exalts them. Brigham Young tosses all of that out. And as your spirit had a beginning, you had a beginning. You began when heavenly parents sexually begat your spirit. And that became the justification for polygamy, because the way a man became a god was the number of offspring he has in the eternities. Therefore, he needs tons of wives so that he can give birth to countless millions, billions of spirit children. And that is still the theology of the LDS Church. That's where the idea of Heavenly Mother comes from. The myths that have arisen that, for instance, that Lazarus wrote, "Oh, my father," and that Joseph Smith loved it. She wrote it after he died. He never saw that. There's no evidence that Joseph ever taught anything like this. In fact, it's contrary to his most radical teaching, the ones that he was defending at the end of his life, the plurality of gods. But this idea basically turned the LDS Church. I'm not using this term derogatorily. This is the way you describe religions, a religion, their focus. It became a fertility cult. It became a religion whose center was all about heterosexual sex and fertility. And the necessity of that heterosexual sex became the way you exalt yourself, through being sealed to as many wives as you could have. Okay, well, that is the source of every problem that the church is now facing. The ordination of women. They'll say heavenly parents, but they won't talk about Heavenly Mother, because they know that if you get into the history of it, you're going to be talking about heavenly mothers. They're going to do everything they can to avoid polygamy. No.
I try to hear some people say, I wonder which of Heavenly Father's wives I came from.
And in my play, The Beehive State, I bring that up because it always frustrated me about talk about Mormon polygamy was that nobody was talking about the theological justification for it, which is this: many heavenly mothers, God having sex. You can't pass yourself off as a Christian, a type of Christian denomination like the LDS is trying to do, and say that God has sex out loud. But that is theology.
That almost answers one of the questions I've had, is that here we were spirits at the beginning of time, but 13.7 billion years have to elapse for me to come to Earth. But if it takes God that long to have sex with all his wives, that would explain it.
The poor man's exhausted. I'm sure they're probably exhausted too. I actually,
take a break.
I played the Beehive State. I actually have it, and I played this. There's actually the center of the play are the two elders and the two fathers in the play. Actually, one is opposed to polygamy. This is 1903. Another one is a post-manifesto polygamist, and they actually argue about polygamy, and it turns into an argument about how many heavenly mothers there are, which then colors the way they see their own lives and the way they view female sexuality and women in general. And so because Mormon theology, LDS theology, is still centered upon this concept of eternal heavenly sex between God and a heavenly mother, until they get rid of that and return to Joseph Smith's original theology, which is in their scriptures, because this theology of that your spirit is begotten by God is found nowhere in LDS scripture.
Yeah, I actually had lunch with 3 sisters and 3 elders, missionaries in our state. Happened to be at the hamburger joint where they have an account where members donate to, and so the missionaries can go and get free burgers. And we got to talking about some things, and I said, a problem is kind of, polygamy. And one of the sister missionaries says, "Oh, polygamy, that's just history. That's just something that was done a long time ago." And I said, well, if you read section 132 at one sitting, you'll know that it's theology, and it's exactly what Mormonism's all about.
Right. And I don't know. I think there's still a lot of things need to be discovered about 132. I do think that Joseph Smith had a revelation on polygamy. I don't know that.
You don't think he was the sole author of it?
I'm thinking that I think there were a lot of embellishments, just like because he's not the sole author of the so-called history. That was dictated before he was born, but most of what we have now was written after, was edited together, rewritten, rephrased after he was born for decades.
And the revelation comes 10 years after or so, 9 years after Joseph's demise, Joseph's murder.
Right.
And so anything could have happened.
Yeah, I think Joseph Smith basically fooled around with free love. I think he actually thought, in a way, it's not too different from what most people think today. Adultery aside, most people believe that if two consenting adults like each other and decide to have sex, a sexual relationship, and they love it, they're respectful of one another, it's consensual, then it's morally okay. I think he believed that.
And polyamory's in a way.
I think he had an affair with Fanny Alger. I don't think that was any sort of wife there. I think he propositioned Nancy Reagan. I think they say, we love each other. We're attracted to each other. What's bad in one situation could be good in another. Which is that moral relativism true? But there was some truth to that too.
And polyamory has a basis in like the human condition, and the history of evolution.
And I think that they acknowledge, I know probably Pratt did early on, but I think they were trying to come to what does this mean that people can be sexually attracted to and love many people.
Right. If you can have 12 kids and love them all.
Right. Yeah.
You can have 12 wives and love them all.
Right. And now, I don't know if sealing when he was supposed to seal to these women. I even question that because the idea of spiritual wifery, spiritual marriage meant that there was no marriage certificate, there was no marriage ceremony. You had a spiritual connection. You were spiritually connected. It was more like two people find each other charismatic, and they basically decide to have sex, which is pretty much the way the world has always operated. And nowadays, in the 20th, 21st century, after the so-called sexual revolution of the 50s, 60s, and 70s, that's the way most people live their lives anyway. People will live with multiple people before they get married. They will have multiple sexual relationships before they decide to be monogamous with one person. Now, when you transgress the laws of monogamy, I mean, when you commit adultery, that's actually a legal offense. I do think that Joseph Smith, by any stretch of the imagination, was an adulterer. If he had sex with other women other than Emma, he broke the law. He was an adulterer. There's no getting around that. He may have believed that he was married to them. Everybody might believe it wasn't adult. It was adultery. So I see Joseph Smith as an adulterer. I also think, I don't know, I think there's just a lot to learn about all of this. Until William Clayton's journals are released, I don't think we're going to have a better idea. But we got to get rid of this idea that everything that Brigham Young taught, or that it was claimed 30, 40 years later by polygamists, is actually verifiable, because all of it isn't. And I'm not a polygamy denier. I do not believe that Joseph Smith was monogamous, but I don't believe that what he was
exactly
doing,
the way.
I don't. Certainly, he did not have this theology, and that theology about heavenly parents sexually begetting spiritual offspring is found nowhere in the scriptures. It's found nowhere in the teachings of Joseph Smith, and it actually contradicts, again, his most radical teachings about the nature of the individual.
It almost makes me wonder, like there's one scripture that says the sons of God shouted for joy, right?
Yeah, that's in Job.
I guess if you're a human being and you think about what it would take for all these sons of God to appear, the concourses of heaven, it could be done with one man and a million wives.
Yeah,
right.
But also, and that's looking at Job from an LDS perspective, and from a Hebraic perspective, the sons of God, there was God, there was Yahweh or Elohim, but there were all these other gods and divine beings too. So the sons of God, they weren't literal offspring of God; they were divine beings too. They were lesser gods.
But I just mean Joseph Smith could read that, and Brigham Young, and try to do the math.
Another thing that Brigham Young introduced that you don't necessarily have in the teachings of Joseph Smith or the scriptures is that the war in heaven, that we all voted, that we were there and we decided who to follow. That's not what's in Moses and the book of Abraham. It's talking about the gods having a council, and Lucifer rebels against the gods, and he is evicted from heaven. But Brigham Young introduced this idea that no, we all were in that council,
grand council,
spirits, and we voted, and 2/3 of us decided to follow Christ, and a third decided to follow Lucifer, and therefore, and then a third but they became the demons. The third that didn't follow either one, they became black people. So the racism is, and Joseph Smith never taught that. Even the theology that was used to justify racism against black people until 1978 rather, came from this Brigham Young theology and this idea that we were in the Grand Council, as opposed to it being what Joseph Smith describes, a council of the gods.
Yeah, that's like a hidden big miss.
It's a big miss. But that was Brigham Young's miss. Joseph Smith doesn't teach that we voted in that council. He's talking about gods having a council, not us being there and voting. That's a Brigham Young invention.
Except for in, I'm talking about in the Book of Mormon, where it says that dark skin is loathsome.
Oh, that's true. That's true. I mean, yeah, but he, exactly. But that wasn't because of, that's a total miss. I mean, but again, he was white, living in a slave society. And
that was what was in the air.
Well, also the conundrum that the Enlightenment thinkers had when they started teaching, and when Americans started believing that all people are created equal. But how do you justify slavery then? So what happened? They started looking back to the Bible, to irrational interpretations of things. Oh, it must be a curse. It must be because of Ham. It must be because of Cain. And racism, the concept of race as being different other than like nationality, really evolved from the 1600s on. With the introduction of African slavery into Europe and the Americas, racism became a thing.
Yeah. And Joseph Smith trying to codify the racism as, from the descendants of Ham is a big miss. That
it is, but it's also married with sort of an attempt at a big win, which is because what in the Book of Mormon, what is he working towards? And it's in 2nd Nephi and Jacob. It's basically this thing where the whites, where the Jews, the righteous Gentiles, and the Native Americans all come together somewhere in the Midwest.
Unification.
And they create the New Jerusalem, Zion.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason Mormons ended up in Ohio is because they were initially going from New York State to convert the Native Americans on the reservations.
Right. But unfortunately, they have to like change their skin color in order to.
Or God has to. Yeah.
God has to work a miracle on that.
Yeah. So I mean, you had an early Mormon hymn, the very first Mormon hymnal was, it's so racist, but they, in light of its time, it was probably seen as very progressive and sort of like, oh, red man, you're in the wild, you're wearing your loincloths and hunting and barely surviving. Don't you realize that you are a chosen people, that you are descended from Israel, that, you're going to learn this and you're going to realize how noble you really are. Again, very positive and very progressive for its time, the time being in a society that was just totally racist and where white people couldn't help seeing themselves as being superior to everyone else in this very race-conscious time. And of course, we're still struggling with it. But so when you're a racist trying to overcome racism or trying to get rid of it, you're probably going to do it in really offensive ways.
So Rob, thanks for coming on our show. It's great chatting with you every time. I learn more things. Thanks to all the viewers. Thanks for watching. Everybody like and subscribe. Maven's not here right now, but in our description of the show, we have a list for a tip jar, and Maven could really use some funding right now. So if anybody wants to, if anybody made it this far and wants to donate to Maven, that would be great. She could use a little bit of extra money right now. All right. Thanks so very much, Rob. We'll just say goodbye to everybody and have us. Let's see. We're approaching summer. We're not quite there yet, but things are looking bright.
They are.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye.